My name's Trevor. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the co-founder of the Bliss Collective. Bliss stands for Black Liberation, Indigenous Sovereignty. We're a solidarity and action hub that's building solidarity-based narrative infrastructure. And our mission is to spark radical collaboration and narrative alignment across Black, Indigenous, and working class issues and movements to repair, decolonize, and reshape culture. And I've had the pleasure of working with Jess and the team at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for over the past 2 years now to help them and others really think about how can we advance a narrative on health equity across the country. I'll pass it to Jess.
Thanks, Trevor. Yes, I'm Jess Setzman. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We are working to take bold leaps with others to achieve a world where health is not a privilege, but a right for all. And so I'm really excited to join you all. I've been a member of ComNet for many, many years now. And so really excited to see some familiar names and folks on here and excited to share some of the work that we've been doing with Bliss and with others across the health equity field to really think about how we use narratives to shift the world to create the environment where health equity is possible. So we're excited to dive in and talk to you a little bit about what we'll be talking through with you today. So first, of course, we'll do our welcoming and introductions. Trevor will lead us through a really great grounding. And then we'll talk about what is this health equity narrative house that we are sharing with you today. We'll talk about how we address some of the resistance and challenges, some of the roadblocks that are out there that keep us from achieving the world that we want to see. We'll talk about the deep narratives or the values, sometimes the mindsets. People might use different terms, but we're going to talk about the deep narratives that we want to see more of in the world and make sure that we've got some practical takeaways for all of you as you're taking this into the work that you're doing. And then just a reminder that we'll be available for the office hours and for Q&A afterwards. So we'll jump in and let Trevor take us through our grounding exercise.
Thanks, Jess. So I know, as I'm sure all of you know, we're living in a time when the dominant narratives about health are narrow, reactive, and often rooted in blame. Blame of individuals, blame of communities, and a framing that too often ignores the structural and historical roots of harm. We see it in the way public conversations prioritize cost over care, illness over wellness, and survival over thriving. And yet, across the countries and across movements, we believe and we see that people are telling new stories and building new power. Stories that insist that health is not just the absence of disease, but the presence of dignity, safety, connection, and joy. Stories that are rooted in health equity, not as charity, but as injustice. And so before we begin, I invite you into just a short reflection. Take a deep breath in through your nose and let it out slowly. Bring to mind a time when you felt deeply cared for by a person, a place, or a collective, and let that memory rise in your body. How did it feel to be held? How did it feel to be seen? How did it feel to be valued? And hold that feeling throughout this presentation, throughout this conversation, because we want that feeling, that embodied sense of safety and care to resonate here and outside after we're done today, because it is at the heart of this narrative and that feeling that we're working to build across society. So today we'll explore the Health Equity Narrative House, not just as a framework, but as a tool to help us expand the public imagination and shift the conditions under which health justice can become possible. So thank you for allowing me to hopefully ground the room. I hope that something came to mind and you'll hold that feeling throughout the presentation, throughout the conversation. And so where we wanted to start before we start talking around what the narrative house is what is a narrative? So narratives are more than just a story. They're the underlying systems of stories, values, assumptions, and meanings that shape how we interpret the world. They really help us make sense of complex issues. They determine what questions are asked, what solutions are seen as possible, who is seen as credible. And I think the really important thing to think about is that narratives are collective. They're not just individual. They live within culture, they live within institutions, they live within policies, and not just in headlines or in hashtags. And so we wanted to uplift a couple of quotes around narrative that we hope will stick with you and really make clear what we're talking about today. So, the first is narrative is the primary form by which experience is made meaningful. A second is from a historian, James Frazier, who says, our inability to look at things as if they could be otherwise is one of the greatest problems of our society, which I think really speaks to the challenge that we see in front of us today. And then the last is power is in tearing human minds to pieces and putting them together again in new shapes of your own choosing. I think that's a good segue into some definitions that we want to uh, lift up before diving in. And so at the Bliss Collective, we define narrative as a collection of stories that circulate within a society that convey themes, frames, and worldviews that are collectively understood and embraced by its members, the members of the society. We define narrative power as the ability to influence perceptions, understandings, mindsets, and ideologies within a society. And so I think it's really important today for us to really think about power and narrative power. Thinking about that as the ability to define reality for ourselves and for our society, who we believe we are as a society, what we believe is possible as a society, whose voices are centered in our collective conversation. And we believe narrative power is very related to movements. And movements succeed not only when laws are changed or campaigns are won, but when they shift the dominant narratives of a society. And of course, what we're talking about today are narratives that uphold an unjust system. And so without narrative power, even the best policy solutions can be ignored, misunderstood, or weaponized. So we really believe that building narrative power means resourcing the people and communities and movements most impacted by injustice to allow them to think about how they can be the narratives of their own story and shift public consciousness. So of course, at ComNet, um, it wouldn't be a presentation unless we talked about strategic communications. And my background is in media relations and strategic communications. And I think there's often this perhaps conflation, but I understand where it comes from between narrative change and strategic communications, because obviously every time we're communicating something, we're delivering a message and trying to change how people think about it. But given that last slide and what we're trying to talk about today, we just wanted to dissect some of the differences in the intersections between narrative change and strategic communications. So at the functional level, we believe narrative change thinks about shifting broader cultural stories, mental models, frames, worldviews, as I just walked through. Strategic communications convey specific messages or information targeted to audiences. Goals, I think they do overlap, they intersect, but I think on the narrative change side, we're thinking about transforming dominant narratives that exist within a society. On the strategic communication side, thinking about conveying messages on a shorter term timeline to execute a mission of an organization or a campaign, or of course, or an action. And then time frame. Narrative change, think we generally think about it on a longer term timeline, decades. Strategic communications, thinking about short to medium term focus, measurable outcomes. We do also believe that narrative change has measurable outcomes, but things that we can communicate and achieve in weeks, months, or a campaign cycle. And I think I really want to make clear that I don't think strategic communications and narrative change are opposites. I think they work best in alignment. I think communications efforts can and do reinforce, test, and scale like broader narrative strategies. Narrative change needs communication tactics to reach audiences and build that cultural fluency. So the goal is not to choose one over the other, but to really think about me as an individual, me as an organization. What is our narrative change strategy if we should have one? What is our strategic communication strategy if we should have one? And using them both in service of a long-term narrative vision. And so, yeah, just really quickly wanting to just give some examples of how narrative change has shown up within society. Um, Decades ago, smoking was seen as normal, even glamorous. Narrative change efforts reframe smoking from simply just a personal choice to a public health issue, tied it to corporate harm and manipulation. Players like Robert Wood Johnson Foundation played a pivotal role in this shift, investing hundreds of millions of dollars in the fight against big tobacco, not just in policy, but in narrative and cultural change. And obviously, people still smoke today, but smoking is no longer seen as socially acceptable in most public spaces. And I think that is, and there's been a dramatic decline in smoking. That is a good example of narrative change. And perhaps the most cited example is marriage equality. So early on, conversations around LGBTQ rights were framed as just simply a legal, political issue, abstract and contentious. I think narrative strategists, the movement really shifted the frame to one of love, family, and fairness, connecting stories to our emotions and humanizing the issue. Um, did a narrative pivot to the freedom to marry the person you love, and that helped move hearts and minds across the political spectrum. And this shift obviously took years from organizers, storytellers, cultural workers, researchers, and funders working together. And then just really want to touch really quickly on audiences. When we start talking about the narrative house, would hope that you can keep this graphic from the Social Change Institute in your mind and some of the questions on the screen, which is where is your current messaging landing on this curve? And what does it look like to move someone from the base to the choir, or really just any segment of this chart to another part of the chart? And so we really think about how narrative change isn't necessarily about speaking to everyone. It's about knowing who you're speaking to, who you're trying to build power with, and power within, and why. So the curve kind of helps us map our audiences across a spectrum. Of course, there are many ways to think about audiences. I think this is one of the most simple and helpful ones. I think the choir really represents the people who are deeply aligned with our values and messages. They don't just agree, they're ready to take action, echo the message, and help it travel. I think there's an overestimation often on how big the choir is. And I believe if we ignore the choir, we miss the opportunity to build real power and real resonance. On the flip side, if we only speak to the choir, we risk becoming insular and disconnected from broader cultural conversations. And so we think strong narratives activate the choir as amplifiers and not just as consumers of the message. The base includes people who share our values but may not be consistently activated or vocal. They're often emotionally aligned but not yet organized or mobilized. We believe narrative strategy should help move people from the base into the choir and obviously in strategic moments, deepen their sense of belonging and investment in the vision, the narrative North Star, which we'll get to on like what that means, and participating in the movement. And we also see the last one I'll touch on is the persuadables. People who may be uncertain, uninformed, or hold conflicting beliefs. Some folks who might come on our side at some times and be on the opposite side at other times. And I think this is where narrative change and communications often intersect. Effective narrative work doesn't or shouldn't compromise values to reach this group, but it should think about how can we tell stories that clarify, invite, and reframe the conversation on our terms. The danger, I think, as the Social Change Institute points out, is treating anyone outside the choir as an opponent. That's how we shrink our narrative power instead of grow it. Pass it to you, Jess.
Awesome. Thank you, Trevor. I really appreciate that. And we just wanted to make sure, as we're having conversations around a particular tool or a particular framework, that we all can understand some of the basic, be on the same page and use similar language in terms of narrative change. And so I appreciate that grounding. So I'll talk a bit about why we even created this tool and what happened. Um, when at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we have been investing in narrative change and learning about narrative change for many years. But we also sort of realized that some of this, and some of you may face similar things, some of it was happening in silos or in disparate places across the foundation. And also, as we were digging in deeper, we started to realize that we actually asked the question both of lab members, which I'll talk about, and of those outside, do you believe that there is a movement for health equity? So I think actually the next slide shows Yes, there we go. Is there a movement for health equity? Sorry, I jumped ahead, Trevor. But this is important because this is the setup, is that the response that we got from lab members and from folks outside of the foundation is that only 41% of them said that they did not think that there was 41% of them said they did not think that there was a movement for health equity. So that was really shocking to us, partially because um, a lot of the folks we were talking to were grantees of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, whose mission centers around health equity. But it was illuminating for us as well. It gets to the point Trevor was making around the choir and the bass and trying to better understand how we can help folks see themselves as a part of this movement, and be singing from the same song sheet in the choir. So we brought together leaders from across the foundation and outside of the foundation for a year-long lab session. And that was really important for us to make sure that while we were going to be creating this tool that we thought, could help us bridge divides, coordinate, and collaborate, that it wasn't something that was just coming from RWJF, but was informed very deeply by those who were practicing health equity in the field. We had a poet, we had a filmmaker, we had folks from across cultural institutions as well to help us kind of collaborate and to create this tool. So I want to, as we think about the role that a tool like this can have in bridging divides and coordinating and bringing people together, I want to start with a question. And this is where Minty comes in. So if you see at the top, join minty.com and use the code right there. And we're going to ask you to participate. You wake up in a world where health equity has been realized. What has changed? What does your day look like? So this is kind of a question that we seeded with folks in our lab, and we'd love for you to write your responses in. We'll give it a little bit of time for folks to either join the Menti and start writing responses. Okay, so we're seeing this is great. We see things around health and economic status. We see things around medical professionals specifically, insurance. I like this one. Fruits and vegetables are affordable, starting to get at some of what we think about at RWJF. So health is not just what happens inside the doctor's office, but all of the things outside as well that contribute to your ability to live your healthiest life possible. We're seeing a lot of things come up around the cost of health, financial aspects. Everyone has access, so we're seeing access here. Free and accessible check-ins, mental health being brought in. This is really great. Expected, I like that, the shifting that health should be an expectation, not based on luck or circumstances. Yeah, no barriers to food and to services. I don't have to scan in at my gym because it's open and free. What an awesome healthy food is available and in a walkable distance. That's great. My neighbors and community members have what they need. Nobody is sleeping on the streets. Another great example of what health equity looks like. I don't need to convince people what science says or what's best for their health. I can relax fully. My foundation would be out of a job. The ER is empty. Okay. So these are really great. And this is actually a very similar exercise to one of the things that we did in this lab where, with folks from within the foundation and outside of the foundation, that the Bliss team led us through a freedom dreaming exercise where we allowed ourselves to dream about what this world looks like, which is a really important part of narrative change, is for us to understand what we are working towards and help people to envision and imagine a world that is different and the world that we want to see more of. So thank you so much. Everyone is speaking. Thank you all so much for adding in your thoughts there. We really appreciate it. So I will jump in just quickly on what is the narrative house, but knowing that I just talked about a little bit about what this narrative North Star means, an articulation of the vision of the narrative strategy. What does the society look like once health equity has been achieved? That is what we wrote for our narrative North Star. And thank you all so much for helping us to add to those today. I'll briefly talk on the parts of the narrative house, but know that we're not going to have time to dive into everything today. So I'm going to add into the chat the place that you can download the whole narrative house. There's a document that is frames what the narrative house is and everything in it. And then there's also one that's the action guide that gives you prompts to think about how to put it into use and into the work that you're doing every day. But so just know that particularly in this current narrative environment, we need all folks to think of themselves as a part of this health equity movement. So we hope that you'll go there and dig in deeper into it. But we'll talk a little about the North Star, the narrative North Star today, and we'll talk about the deep narratives today, which are those underlying values and themes that ground this narrative house and the stories that are in it. And we're also going to talk about something that's not here, but is really important and is in the larger document, which is the narrative roadblocks, the things that we think are in the way and stopping us from being able to achieve this narrative North Star. Other areas to dig into when you can are the narrative areas of opportunity. Those are strategic places where we think that there's ripe narrative metaphors that can help us break through some of these roadblocks that we see. There's core narratives, which is an attempt to catalog some of the themes that are already out there, some of the narratives we already see in the health space. And then there's I think great for for this group of folks at ComNet, there are types of stories that we want to be seeing more of. So how can you tell stories based on certain frames or certain ways that we want to be seeing a lot of these told? So that's a really great place to dig into after this. So I'll let Trevor take us through the narrative North Star.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. So, as Jess mentioned, in the first phase of the lab, where we brought together organizers, strategists, health equity experts alongside Robert Wood Johnson Foundation staff, one of the first things that we did when we started to build the narrative house was think about the North Star. Where are we going? What's the articulation of the vision of the narrative that we're trying to build in the future? And really an answer to the question, what does society look like once we've achieved health equity? And so what we came up with, we did like an iterative process. And I'll read it, the North Star. And I think you'll see as I'm reading it that a lot of the things that you all mentioned a couple questions ago will show up here. So we stood boldly, journeyed down a beautiful reckoning process, and emerged a transformed society. Across communities, we've migrated toward a common vision that health is life. We've built a new world, a loving one, anchored in community stewardship. In this new society, living a healthy, fulfilled, and whole life is no longer a privilege only a few can enjoy, but a right enshrined in our values and practices. We embody it in our actions. Our care is cultural and competent, rooted in our shared but diverse histories. Across our neighborhoods, our food and water replenish us, not just our bodies, but our hearts, souls, and cells. Our community spaces offer cool refuge, our homes protect us, and we journey down roads that lead us to work that fulfills our needs. Decisions about our communities are guided by those who call those communities homes. We sleep well here, free of fear, full of hope. We rise refreshed. Chronic stress is um, something our children have only heard of, but have never experienced. There is a confidence in the air, an unwritten law that the nation's well-being is our collective responsibility. The entrance of life is safe and joyful for every bearer. Every child welcomed into the society is cherished from their very first breath. Bodies in all their shapes, sizes, and entirety are protected from harm and taken care of. All abilities are respected and autonomy is upheld. We smile much more than we used to. It's a beautiful sight. We are housed, all of us. Every zip code is a haven where people can live their healthiest lives. Money is not our idol. It does not dictate our lives, our health, or our wealth. Rest is no longer something we experience only on vacation, but is baked into our lives. Our health system is proactive. It nurtures us in a basket of compassion, accessibility, and dignity tailored to our needs. Yes, we've paved a new way and we've written the American dream into a story where we value healthy, fulfilled, and whole lives above all else. So hope you just take a second and yeah, please drop in the chat how that might resonate with you, what feelings came up as you were hearing this narrative North Star. Is this a place that you would want to live? And if so, how do we get there? So a little bit about how you can use the narrative North Star as an organization, as an individual, as a storyteller. We believe that it's helpful to present a visionary roadmap for your organization. When we thought about the narrative house, we use the word schema instead of framework because schematics are more flexible. We see the narrative house as an invitation. And so we hope that folks can look at this North Star and add to it, play with it, think about how they could use it for their own organizational vision, for their own campaign vision. But hopefully, it's a good starting place. Because as we saw in the question we just asked previously, as we saw in the narrative lab, a lot of us are thinking about the same thing as it relates to the narrative North Star. But then why do most of us not feel, or a good number of us not feel like there is a movement for health equity? So that is the key thing that is on top of my mind and the work that we're trying to do with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So we also hope it can establish a common future across sectors and issues, and we also hope it could be a tool for funder organizing. Now, what stands in the way of this North Star? What stands in the way of the narratives within the narrative house? So we actually, before we created the narrative house, named the roadblocks that stand in our way. And we said we named specific ones, which I will get into on the next slide, but we also wanted to name that anti-Blackness, American exceptionalism, and structural bias undergirded all of the specific narrative roadblocks that stand in our way. And until we can shift public consciousness around these things, health equity will not be realized. And then we name some specific kind of narrative roadblocks that stand in our way. And I'll very quickly run through them. I think we have to understand when we're thinking about narrative, it's not just about like what we're saying, but what we're up against. And these narrative roadblocks come up in ways that are rooted in misinformation and then are also just rooted in dominant and cultural stories that people take in every day and messages that people take in every day. And then they shape how people interpret health, what we deserve as it relates to health, as a individual, as a country, as my neighbor, and then also how people interpret justice and responsibility, and particularly collective responsibility as a nation. So the first one that we named was toxic individualism. We defined it as the mindset that individual actions and choices are the sole determinants of a person's life outcomes. It's the belief that people are solely responsible for themselves. It obscures the role of policy, environment, and history in shaping health. And we feel like to counter this, we need more stories of interdependence, community care, shared responsibility, and thinking about how we can build power around those stories. Deservingness, the mindset divide, this mindset divides people into the worthy and unworthy categories based on race, on class, on behavior, on health status. It kind of underpins punitive policies and underpins underinvestment in historically marginalized communities. So narrative change would invite us to challenge the notion of earned dignity and instead focus on universal rights, shared humanity, as some of you all named earlier. Scarcity and zero sum, probably the one that cuts across all issues that focus on anything related to equity, transformation, justice. The idea that if one group gains something, another one is going to lose something. It's a mindset rooted in fear and competition. It keeps us from imagining win-win solutions and collective progress. And we believe we can disrupt this by telling stories that show how equity benefits everyone, how there is abundance, and what's possible when we work together and think about distribution. The all one race mindset, which we believe this mindset kind of erases racial disparities by pretending that race does not exist, or we don't need to acknowledge racial disparities because why they exist is not because it's not a result of race. It can sound like color blindness or we're all just human, and it denies the lived experiences of systemic harm. Narrative change, and what we named in the lab, requires us to name race explicitly while also pointing to a shared future we can build together. And then lastly, the market knows best mindset. This mindset kind of treats inequality as inevitable and markets as neutral, as we're seeing right now. They are not. It frames health and well-being as commodities, not as collective responsibilities or the responsibility of a nation. And so we know that we need stories that center people over profit and reframe care as something that the nation should invest in and not a private luxury. And so we know, as I'm sure you all do, these roadblocks are embedded everywhere in media, in policy, and in culture, and they won't just disappear on their own. Naming them, we believe, is the first step toward replacing them with the deep narratives that we will talk a little bit about later. So we just wanted to pause again and ask, what are some of the main narrative roadblocks that stand in the way of of your work? Seeing some, we can't afford climate action budget, caring for everyone is too expensive. Lack
Mm.
of understanding of the role of unjust systems, who deserves dignity. Every one of those narrative roadblocks feels relevant to all of the issues that I work on. Seeing a lot.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Oh, I was
Jess.
just going to say, Trevor, you're also seeing, I think, how some of this is one of the things we're realizing is when you name a narrative roadblock, if you really start digging deeper into it, sometimes you'll realize that we don't have enough. That's that scarcity mindset. That's that zero sum. It's us versus them, zero sum. So there's a lot I'm seeing here a lot of themes that might be really particular to somebody else's work, maybe even outside of health, but that we can find common areas. And as we think about solidarity and cross-movement solidarity, how do we find these common roadblocks that are stopping a lot of our work? And then also, as we dive into the deep narratives, how do we find common deep narratives that we can all be working together on? So just pulling some of that out.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that, Jessica. I think, yeah, I'm seeing a lot of things here, patriarchy and misogyny, which I think speaks to kind of the structural bias that we were trying to name that undergirds all of what stands in the way of the narrative house. See some scarcity mindset, zero sum, even within grantee partners within a portfolio that, in theory, might be working toward the same thing, which we also talked about within the lab and like just the role of philanthropy in this. Us first, them again. The system is too broken to fix. We don't have enough money to solve everything. I think we see a lot of that, like despair. At Bliss, we talk a lot about the hope gap, which is the gap between belief that an issue is possible, or sorry, the gap between support for an issue and belief that it's possible. And I think a lot of folks feel as if the system is too broken to fix is one that really resonates. Um, National interest versus global interests, excess consumerism, hoarding, individualism is not my problem. Meritocracy. So also very similar to the things that we named the narrative house. So it kind of feels as if we know what are the challenges, and we also seem as if we are aligned on what the vision is. Um, and I think the collaboration, the solidarity building is one of the biggest challenges that stands in the way of us building real power. So I'm gonna pass it to Jess to talk about some of the deep narratives.
Thank you, Trevor. So I really appreciate all of you sharing those with us. And as we were just talking about, how is it that we are going to counter some of these uh, really harmful and really deeply entrenched narratives and mindsets that are out there and that stop us from doing this work? So what we have named is a set of deep narratives that we think there are these like I said, sometimes you might talk about them as values. Sometimes they're also considered mindsets depending on where they are. But really, this is what we want to shift people to. How do we move from individualism to interdependence, and that being the frame that we bring to stories and to the communications that we're seeing. I was talking with somebody recently about, some of the work that they were doing, and they were asking, well, isn't it narrative change if we're just able to sort of, get more leaders of color into positions of power? That's changing the narrative. And our conversation was really around, well, what do people fill in the story of how they got there? Because that's the narrative. And if there are dominant narratives out there and around perhaps how somebody got into a position, what are we doing to change that and to help people think differently about it? And so I think that's also a good way for us to say, like, how do we move into these new places? So we can't go into each of these today, but just know, like, radical empathy. We want to be seeing more stories about empathy, and I know that there's a lot of news right now about empathy and or the lack of it. And how do we see more stories that lift up comprehensive healing, um, and how we see disciplined hope? Went to that last because we're going to dive into that one a little bit here on the next slide. So a value that we want to be seeing in our stories more is that couples optimism and action, but understands that the status quo is real and exists, and we are up against things, but it can be changed. So one of the things that we have talked about around at RWJF is we did a big study. I think we shared with ComNet folks around the connection between structural racism and health and the messaging that we could use to help people see that connection. We are actually just refreshing that. We were in the field last month with some refreshing of that. And one of the things that we are seeing is that cynicism is at an all-time high. Trevor was just talking about the hope gap. How is it that people want something, they believe something should happen, but they just don't believe that it ever will? And so we think that disciplined hope is an incredibly important narrative for right now, for meeting the moment. It always is, but certainly for right now, that we're able to help people move past. I think I saw when we were naming roadblocks, somebody said there was sort of like a why bother mentality towards climate change or other things. So trying to help people really understand that people created this system and therefore people can change it. And so that's one of the reasons that we feel like disciplined hope is such an important thing for us to be talking about right now. So I wanted to ask you all, what are some of the specific stories in your community that are giving you hope, and how can we socialize them? Where can we socialize these stories, and how can we be telling more stories that are underpinned by this deep narrative of disciplined hope? Seeing some folks talk about young people. And that's real. I appreciate the person being real, saying that, I'm cynical and I don't see such stories. I think that is a great point as to why we need to be telling more stories that have just, that are built on hope. I'm a Star Wars nerd, so I'll say rebellions are built on hope. Um, so we definitely want to be seeing more stories of that. It's a little small for me, Trevor, but if you're seeing some you can pull out.
Yeah, I saw young people at the top. I think for me, just yesterday, NYU was going to have a very, very like hateful event on campus around immigrants, and all of the student groups got together, sent a letter, and shut it down. That was just yesterday. And Bliss, we have some poet fellows that are part of that. So the young people are giving me hope. I think community members showing up to support trans youth athletes. I think a lot of the stories around hope right now we're going to see at the local level, at the on the ground. Grandparents raising grandchildren and thriving. I love that one. Long-term investments in infrastructure projects coming to fruition. I think that's really important. Communities building a park and a community center. That's really inspiring. I agree. That's really inspiring. People are learning the power of government and democracy, also economics. People, many people don't understand tariffs. Tariffs, yeah, I was waiting for this one. The hands-off marches to me was an amazing to see. I'm gonna move us along so that we can get to questions. But I think as somebody mentioned in the chat, we have the ability to save these answers, and so we can definitely share them after.
100%. So we wanted, I already talked a little bit about how we can use the deep narratives, but we hope that they'll support you as you create, narrative strategies for how you want to change. We really think this is a great place for cross movement solidarity, as I talked about, where we can all come together, even if we're not working on the same issues, and talk about more, putting more hopeful messages, talk about putting more messages around interconnectedness instead of independence, et cetera, into the world. In policy development, how do we bring up some of these deep narratives as we're thinking about policies? And so, we look forward also to hearing from you about how you're thinking about putting some of these deep narratives to work. So, there's coming back to this, hopefully you're starting to see here the roof, our narrative North Star, what we're all working towards, our foundation, the deep narratives, what we want to be seeing more of, and all the values we want to see more of across all of our stories. And then we hope that you'll dig into the narrative areas of opportunities, the core narratives, and the types of stories that we want to be seeing in the world when you download the Narrative House, because we don't have time to do that today. All right. And we would be remiss if we did not talk a little bit about tracking impact. So we'll like quickly go through this, but we want to make sure we leave time for questions. So, we just briefly wanted to talk about how are we thinking about measurement? So we want to see shifts, of course, in cultural values. We want to see more, like we said, cultural output. So more stories being told. Either we love the convergence partnerships report on philanthropy and narrative change, and they really think about narrative change in three areas: mass movements, mass culture, and mass media. And so we want to be seeing more and more out there around in each of these areas that are undergirded with these deep narratives. And there's already, one of our narratives we talk about in the area of opportunity is around belonging. There are indexes that track how people feel, like a belonging index, and how people feel a sense of belonging. And so we can look at things like that and just see some of that, and then analyze themes of cultural products over time. We can look at the collection of stories in the media, in television, film, and other places, and kind of get a sense of how many stories are being told with our narrative roadblocks as the main themes, or with the ones that we want to be seeing out there. And like we said, in policy framing too. Anything to add to this, Trevor, before we jump into?
No, nothing for me here. I think there's just one more slide.
Yeah. Yeah, so we won't go through all of this because we didn't get to go through each of these today, but we just talked a little bit about the deep narratives, but know that we're also thinking about how to measure our narrative North Star, areas of opportunities, core narratives, and stories, and how you can also be thinking about that if you're taking this schema and the schematic and putting it into use at your own organization.
Yeah. And then I think that's the one thing I'll say here is that I think on the funding side, a lot of funders have questions around, well, like, how do we actually know where the narratives are changing? And which is why we try to kind of link each parts of the narrative house to a metric and something that we could track over time, and just noting that groups and researchers and movements and organizations, need resources to be able to see things shift over time if we actually do want to track our impact.
All right. Huge note of gratitude to Jess and Trevor for their time and wisdom today. Thank you both so much. So we do have some time left over for Q&A. We will also have office hours. So at the top of the hour at 2 o'clock, we'll switch over to a new Zoom link and we can do additional questions that we don't get to in the ensuing 9 minutes over there. So if you have a question now, please put it into the Q&A function in Zoom. I think it's shows up as a box when you hover over the bottom. Maybe it's a little bit different if you're not a presenter, but start adding your questions to that, and I will go through those in order. You can also, I think, like questions, and I think the most liked ones move to the top. So, all right, let's get underway here. Layla asks, I'd love to know what you're learning and seeing about the different types of formats for telling stories and how they are working or not working.
I can take that. So where we are with the lab, or where we are with the narrative house in the lab right now, are, so the first phase of the lab, we brought folks together to really help them think about what are the narratives that we're up against and how can we co-create a narrative house. Um, so that was the first phase. Second phase, where we are right now after publishing it, is taking the narrative house across the foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and helping different program teams think about how they can utilize it for grant making, for tracking their grants, coding their grants, and support grantee partners with using it. And so we're slowly starting to see some partners use it. One of the first ways in which we will kind of collaboratively use the narrative house is we are Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Bliss, and Into Action Lab, which is a kind of creative design studio, will be hosting a creative jam called the Health is Life Creative Jam, which, if you paid attention, that's one of the lines in the narrative house, the narrative North Star. And so we'll be bringing about 200 artists together in real time to co-create art. It'll be a mix of visual artists, designers, invited some musicians, some poets, where we will use different parts of the narrative house to create art in real time. So that is one of the first ways in which we will be kind of utilizing the narrative house to like create content and create stories. But we have other ideas of how we might be able to do that. One of the things that Bliss does is we work with content creators to create content and test that content. And so there are ways in which I think we as a team will use the narrative house, and we hope that through things like this gives folks ideas of how to use it. And I think our hope is that there's just so many things happening that result as a result of the narrative house that we can't track all of them.
Yeah. And I'll also just mention that since I sit in the comms team at RWJF, and if you get the narrative house from the download link, you'll see the different types of stories. We're also just internally trying to make sure that all of our communications are aligned with this and that we're using the story archetypes, that we're using these, the types of in all of the communications that are coming out from RWJF. We're really trying to do that. And shout out, because I think I saw Rachel in the chat. We did an audit with Narrative Initiative. They helped us to do a narrative audit when I first got to the foundation 3 years ago to kind of track all the comms coming out of RWJF and the deep narratives that were a part of that. And our hope is to do that again now that we have this new framework that we're thinking about, or this new schematic that we're using, in order to see how our comms have changed personally. So more to come on that, but yeah.
All right, our next question is from Melissa. Timelines are a big tension with narrative work. People want results yesterday, but or maybe that's supposed to be what role does time have in tracking impact of the narrative change?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And Trevor, you talked a little bit when we thought about the difference between strategic comms and narrative change. Oftentimes, when we're looking at narrative change, we are looking at a much longer time horizon. But when we talked about the metrics there at the end, there are things that we can track year over year, and we can see how we're moving the needle on certain things. So I think this is a little bit of both and. Like we can see if we are making short-term movement and some of the things we want to see, with the understanding that our funding and our commitment to true lasting cultural change has to be long-term. Trevor, I don't know if you have more to add to that.
I wouldn't add anything to that. I mean, well, maybe I would say that I think a part of what needs to happen is stuff like this, where funders need to be in conversation with partners on how to do this work, right? Because I think if funders aren't learning along the way, I think they'll keep giving like 1 year grants, 1 year grants. But I think if they can see the power being built, the narrative power being built, it can lead to like longer lasting investment. So yeah, I think just really we should all be thinking about how can we help funders like do the learning so that we can get the investments to do the work.
100%.
Next question is from Carly. What types of tools do you use for various types of tracking?
Yeah, I can start off. Well, I mean, I think the one my question would go to like which aspect of tracking are we talking about? I mean, I think historically, like I used to work at a think tank center on budget and policy priorities. I used to work at the ACLU. And when it came down to like tracking our impact as an organization, as it relates to like comms and media, it really was the comms team looking into how many times were we cited in notable media outlets. And I think that's obviously like still a common way to track impact. And then obviously like social media impact, like likes, uh, retweets, things of that nature. What I hope we start to move toward is like really not like to me that's like kind of like surface level impact. You could get something in the New York Times, but you don't necessarily know how many people read it, and you definitely don't know like what they felt after they read it. So one of the things that we do at Bliss is that we try to do like sentiment testing, really trying to better understand how like certain pieces of content that folks would actually see out in the world impacts their support, belief, and like emotions. So we've used at Bliss, we've used Swayable, which is has been, I think, over the past 5 years, like a more popular tool to do some of that testing. And there's like other firms similar to that. But one of the things that I guess I'll say is that I think ideally orgs would be able to have either partnerships with like universities or in-house researchers to use like some of the same like survey methods that universities use, so that we could have the same like rigorous analysis.
All right. I think we have time for maybe one more quick one. So for Marissa, when telling stories, how do you collaborate with communities to ensure the storytelling isn't extractive?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think some of it is narrative change, some of it is, the way that we practice our communications. I mean, we've done a huge shift in looking at from RWJF, like where is it important for us to use our voice? Where is it important we love metaphors. Where should we hold the mic? Where should we pass the mic? Where should we be backup singers or be in harmony or and so a lot of what we have been doing is actually sort of partnering with grantees on stories that they want to tell. So it's more like we'll go we have a beautiful video storytelling series on birth justice, and we talked with 3 different grantees and chose. Actually, we just released some on housing as well that are really awesome. Where we chose different directors who had connections to those communities in some way, and we're able to go in and really sit with and understand and get to know the folks who we were creating these documentaries alongside and with, and the story emerged. We didn't go in with necessarily with an idea. We went in with a partnership and thinking about these deep narratives and like because their values, really trying to live the values in the way that we were producing. And then making sure that they were tools that the grantees and that the folks who were a part of were, one, really proud of, and two, could use in some way that they wanted to do it. So that's I mean, that's one example, but I think that's important. And Trevor, I know you're like really in partnership with content creators, and like content creators are creating their own content based on the themes. Yeah.